At 12:13 a.m., Arthur's phone vibrated in the dead of night. It was a call from his son, David, an FBI agent, whose voice trembled as he spoke. "Dad, turn off all the lights, get up to the attic, and lock the door immediately. Absolutely do not let Chloe and her husband know." Sensing something terrible was unfolding, Arthur followed his son's instructions without a moment's hesitation, only to peer through a small crack in the attic floorboards and silently witness a scene that would completely destroy everything he had ever believed about his family. But before we dive deep into his tragedy, I want to send my sincere thanks to you for being here to listen. So please drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching this video from, because your engagement means the world to me. And also a quick note that the story you are about to hear intertwines a few fictional elements for storytelling and educational purposes, so any resemblance to actual names or places is entirely unintentional, but the lessons shared undoubtedly hold immense value. Now, let's begin. His name was Arthur Pendelton. He was 69 years old, and he had spent his entire career as a meticulous forensic accountant, untangling webs of financial fraud and lies from this classic Colonial home in Alexandria, Virginia. To understand how a man who had spent 4 decades sniffing out corporate deception could become a prisoner in his own home, we have to go back exactly 8 months. That was when the light completely went out of Arthur Pendelton's life. His beloved wife, Eleanor, lost her fierce, year-long battle with cancer. For over 40 years, she had been the beating heart of that sprawling colonial house. When she passed away, she took the warmth, the vibrant laughter, and the color of life with her, leaving behind a cavernous, silent shell. The polished mahogany floors no longer echoed with her light footsteps, and the grand living room, once perpetually filled with the sweet scent of her fresh garden flowers, smelled only of settling dust and fading memories. Arthur drifted through those first few agonizing months like a ghost haunting his own existence. The brilliant man who could once spot a single fabricated invoice hidden within a stack of thousands now found himself staring blankly at the wall for hours, utterly unable to focus on the simplest of daily tasks. His son David, stationed hundreds of miles away on demanding federal assignments, called as often as his schedule allowed, his voice always laced with a quiet, helpless worry. But distant phone calls over a crackling line could not fill the immense physical void in the massive house. Arthur was profoundly, overwhelmingly lonely, drowning in an ocean of grief that seemed to have no shore. That crushing isolation was precisely what his daughter, Chloe, was counting on. Chloe had always been the absolute apple of Arthur's eye. Growing up, she was the sweet little girl who would sit patiently on his lap while he reviewed complex tax documents, pretending to understand the endless columns of ledgers. To Arthur, she was flawless. He could never see the subtle, insidious entitlement that had blossomed in her during her late 20s, nor the cold calculation that lay hidden beneath her expensive designer clothes and perfectly manicured exterior. He only saw his grieving daughter, a fellow victim of the same tragic loss that was tearing his own soul apart. 6 months ago, Chloe arrived at the quiet house with her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a man who loudly described himself as a high-end real estate investment consultant, though his actual business ventures always seemed vague and mysteriously fluid. He wore perfectly tailored suits, smiled a practiced, brilliant smile, and always offered an overly firm handshake. Arthur had never entirely warmed up to Marcus, sensing a shallow opportunism buried in the younger man, but because Chloe claimed to love him deeply, Arthur accepted him into the family fold without resistance. They sat together in the quiet, sunlit kitchen one Sunday afternoon. The pale autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching the dancing dust motes in the still air. Chloe reached across the cold marble island and gently covered Arthur's trembling, aged hand with her own soft palms. Her eyes were wide, pooling with masterfully manufactured tears. She told him, her voice cracking perfectly, that she and Marcus were worried sick about him. She insisted that the house was simply too big for one person to manage, that the steep wooden stairs were becoming dangerous, and that the sheer, suffocating weight of the memories was slowly killing him. Then, with a tone as soft and comforting as velvet, she made the fatal proposal. Their apartment lease in the city was ending, she claimed smoothly. What if they moved in with him, just temporarily? They could keep him constant company, cook his favorite hot meals, and manage the heavy upkeep of the aging property. They desperately wanted to take care of him, she whispered, because he had spent his entire life taking such good care of them. Arthur's sharp forensic instincts, the internal alarm bells that would have deafened him in any corporate boardroom, were completely muffled by the desperate yearning of a broken heart. He looked across the table at Chloe and saw only Eleanor's gentle eyes staring back at him. The mere thought of having his family under his roof again, of hearing cheerful voices echoing in the hallway and smelling warm dinner cooking in the kitchen, felt like a vital lifeline thrown into a dark, freezing ocean. He did not ask to see their ending lease. He did not question why Marcus's supposedly lucrative real estate career could not easily afford a new luxury apartment. He simply nodded, his tired eyes brimming with tears of profound gratitude, and said yes. They moved their belongings into the spacious guest wing the very next week. For the first few days, the arrangement truly felt like a heaven-sent blessing. Chloe cooked his favorite comfort meals, and Marcus cheerfully handled the strenuous yard work. The house felt wonderfully alive again. Arthur finally felt he could breathe, completely unaware that he had just handed the golden keys to his kingdom to the very predators who were methodically building a cage around him. He thought he was welcoming his beloved family back home, but in reality, he was laying the very foundation for his own ruin. The illusion of a happy reunited family lasted barely 3 weeks. At first, the arrangement was a comforting blur of shared dinners and warm evening conversations in the living room. But gradually, the vibrant atmosphere began to curdle into something stifling. The attentive care Chloe and Marcus provided subtly morphed into an overwhelming, microscopic level of supervision. Every time Arthur turned around, one of them was hovering nearby, asking if he was feeling dizzy, if he had eaten enough, or if he was confused about the day of the week. The constant questioning planted tiny seeds of doubt in Arthur's usually razor-sharp mind. Then came the evening that changed everything. They were sitting in the dimly lit study after dinner when Chloe approached his leather armchair. She held a small glass of water in one hand and a tiny, unmarked white pill nestled in the palm of the other. Her expression was a masterclass in daughterly devotion, her eyes swimming with deep, empathetic concern. She knelt beside his chair and spoke in a hushed, soothing tone. She told him that she had spoken privately with his general practitioner because she was worried about his recent grief-induced absent-mindedness. The doctor, she claimed smoothly, had highly recommended a daily memory supplement to keep his brilliant mind sharp and stave off the natural cognitive decline of his age. Arthur did not remember scheduling any doctor appointments, nor did he recall giving Chloe permission to discuss his medical records. But the profound exhaustion of his grief, coupled with his absolute, unwavering trust in his little girl, silenced his usually skeptical nature. He looked at the pristine white pill, then at his daughter's pleading eyes, and swallowed it down with a sip of water. He did not know he had just ingested the very poison that would systematically dismantle his reality. Every single night after that, the ritual was repeated. Sometimes Chloe brought the water, sometimes Marcus delivered it with his practiced, reassuring smile, always echoing the exact same phrase about doctor orders. Almost immediately, Arthur felt the devastating effects. The world around him grew thick and sluggish. His thoughts, which had spent decades rapidly deciphering the most complex offshore tax havens and corporate ledgers, now moved like heavy molasses. He would walk into the kitchen to brew coffee and stand frozen in the center of the room, completely unable to remember why he was there. When he tried to read his morning newspaper, the black letters seemed to detach from the paper and float aimlessly across his vision. The debilitating fog scared him more than he dared to admit. He began to wonder if the unbearable grief over losing Eleanor was finally breaking his mind. The terrifying climax of this chemically induced nightmare arrived on a Tuesday night. Arthur woke up shivering, his throat parched. The house was cloaked in heavy silence. He shuffled slowly down the dark hallway toward the bathroom, his bare feet dragging on the cold oak floorboards. Just as he passed the doorway of his master bedroom, he froze. Standing perfectly still in the shadowed corner was Eleanor. She was wearing the pale blue dress she had been buried in. Her eyes were hollow, completely devoid of the warmth he remembered, staring at him with a haunting, tragic sorrow. Arthur felt his heart slam against his ribs. He blinked fiercely, rubbing his eyes with trembling hands, praying the cruel mirage would vanish. But when he opened his eyes again, she was still there. The delicate fabric of her blue dress appeared to sway in a phantom breeze. He tried to speak, to call out her beloved name, but his vocal cords paralyzed. Suddenly, warm hands gripped his shoulders. He gasped and spun around to find Chloe standing behind him, her face twisted in an exaggerated mask of panic. She asked him what he was staring at, her voice loud in the quiet hallway. When Arthur pointed a shaking finger toward the empty corner, trying to explain that his dead wife was standing right there, Chloe pulled him into a tight embrace. She stroked his gray hair like he was a frightened toddler, whispering that he was just having a terrible night terror, that his mind was playing cruel tricks on him because he was getting older and sicker. She guided him gently back to bed, tucking him in under the heavy blankets, solidifying the terrifying narrative that he was losing his sanity. The morning after the hallucination, Arthur was practically catatonic. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his cold oatmeal, feeling entirely detached from his own body. This was the exact moment Marcus chose to make his move. Marcus slid a thick stack of utility bills, tax notices, and bank statements across the smooth marble counter. With a deep sigh of feigned exhaustion, Marcus sat across from Arthur and gently placed a hand over the older man's wrists. Marcus spoke in a low, highly sympathetic voice. He pointed out how exhausted Arthur looked, how the stress of managing the massive estate was clearly taking a devastating toll on his fragile health. Marcus offered to take the heavy administrative burden completely off Arthur's shoulders. He suggested that Arthur simply sign a few routine authorization forms allowing Marcus to access the primary checking accounts and manage the monthly expenses. Marcus promised he would handle every single tedious detail so Arthur could simply rest and recover his failing memory. A year ago, Arthur would have instantly spotted the glaring red flags. A forensic accountant never hands over financial control without an exhaustive audit of the person asking. But the Arthur sitting at that table was a shadow of his former self. His brain was clouded by the heavy sedatives, his spirit broken by the horrifying vision of his dead wife, and his confidence shattered by his daughter's constant reminders of his frailty. Unable to focus his eyes on the fine print of the documents Marcus pushed toward him, Arthur simply nodded his heavy head. He accepted the black-inked pen Marcus pressed into his trembling fingers and signed his name on the dotted lines, blindly surrendering the financial keys to his $5 million estate into the hands of a predator. The ink on the financial authorization forms had barely dried when the next phase of the confinement began. Within a matter of days, Arthur noticed small, unblinking black lenses appearing in the upper corners of his beloved Colonial home. Marcus moved through the house methodically with a power drill, permanently scarring the elegant crown molding Eleanor had chosen so carefully decades ago. When Arthur managed to push through the heavy haze in his mind to ask what Marcus was doing, his son-in-law flashed that same practiced, hollow smile. Marcus explained in a patient, agonizingly condescending tone that the security cameras were strictly for Arthur's own safety. He cited Arthur's recent night wanderings, his terrifying hallucinations, and the inherent risks of an elderly man navigating steep wooden staircases alone. Marcus claimed the cameras were simply a modern fall prevention system, allowing him and Chloe to monitor Arthur in case he had a dizzy spell or forgot to turn off the kitchen stove. Arthur wanted to argue, to demand that the invasive devices be taken down immediately, but the words tangled heavily on his tongue. The daily white pills kept his thoughts moving through a thick, suffocating mud. He found himself simply nodding, quietly accepting his new reality as a prisoner in his own home. The cameras were everywhere. One watched the front door, another captured the entire span of the living room, a third was angled directly at the kitchen island, and one was even tucked discreetly outside his master bathroom. Yet, even in his sedated state, Arthur's dormant forensic mind cataloged a chilling discrepancy. There were absolutely no cameras installed in the guest wing where Chloe and Marcus slept, nor were there any pointed at the small home office Marcus had claimed for himself. They were watching his every single move, entirely controlling his space, while keeping their own sanctuary completely hidden in the shadows. Arthur felt the walls of his golden cage shrinking tighter with every passing day. The breaking point arrived on a quiet, overcast Thursday morning. Chloe and Marcus had left the house early to attend what they'd vaguely described as important investment meetings in the city. For the first time in weeks, Arthur found himself completely alone in the echoing house. He shuffled slowly into the study, desperate for a cup of black coffee to burn away the persistent fog clouding his brain. His limbs felt heavy and uncoordinated. As he reached across Marcus's large mahogany desk to grab a stray coaster, his trembling fingers caught the edge of Marcus's expensive leather briefcase left resting on the edge of the table. The heavy bag tipped over and plummeted to the floor, bursting open upon impact. A thick cascade of folders, printed emails, and legal documents spilled across the polished hardwood floor. Arthur let out a heavy sigh, his aging knees protesting violently as he slowly lowered himself to the ground to clean up the mess before his son-in-law returned. He began gathering the scattered papers clumsily, his clouded eyes struggling to focus on the dense paragraphs of text. Most of it looked like mundane real estate jargon, but then, his hand brushed against a crisp, glossy piece of paper that felt entirely different from the rest. It was a formal, official-looking document bearing the severe, medical letterhead of an institution he had never heard of before. The bold blue letters at the top read Shady Pines Behavioral Center. Below the hospital crest was the title Psychiatric Intake and Evaluation Form. Arthur felt a sudden, icy chill radiate from the base of his spine all the way up to his neck. That was not what made his breath catch in his throat. It was the information meticulously typed into the patient detail section. His own name, Arthur Pendelton, glared back at him. His age, 69 years old. His home address, his social security number, and his primary medical insurance details were all flawlessly filled out. Below his personal information was a clinical checklist designed to assess mental competency. The categories included severe paranoia, visual hallucinations, advanced memory loss, inability to care for self, and danger to self or others. The small boxes next to the terrifying symptoms were currently empty, waiting for a signature, but the narrative was already written in the blank spaces. Someone had gone to great lengths to prepare this specific document. Someone was methodically laying the legal groundwork to have him forcefully evaluated, to have a judge declare him entirely incompetent to manage his own affairs. Arthur remained kneeling on the cold floor, clutching the psychiatric form in his shaking hands. The heavy, drug-induced fog that had paralyzed his mind for weeks was suddenly pierced by a blinding ray of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized in one horrifying instant that the cameras, the pills, the sudden isolation from his friends, and the seizure of his bank accounts were not misguided acts of overprotective love. They were the calculated steps of a hostile takeover. Chloe and Marcus were not trying to care for him. They were actively building an airtight case to lock him away in a psychiatric ward for the rest of his life, ensuring they would gain absolute, undisputed control over his $5 million estate. Adrenaline, hot and sharp, surged through his veins, briefly overriding the sedatives. His forensic instincts, dormant since Eleanor's death, roared back to life. He knew with absolute certainty that if Marcus realized the briefcase had been searched, the timeline of their sinister plot would accelerate. With terrifying precision, Arthur memorized the name of the facility, carefully placed the intake form back inside its corresponding manila folder, and meticulously repacked the leather briefcase exactly as it had fallen. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and placed the bag back on the edge of the mahogany desk. He was no longer just a grieving widower losing his mind. He was a wealthy man marked for institutionalization by his own flesh and blood, and he needed a way to fight back from the inside. The adrenaline from discovering the psychiatric evaluation form carried Arthur through the remainder of the agonizing day. When Chloe and Marcus finally returned to the house, Arthur forced himself to play his part flawlessly. He shuffled his feet against the floorboards, kept his eyes entirely vacant, and complained in a weak voice about a terrible migraine. Then came the dreaded nightly ritual. Chloe entered the study carrying the small white pill and a glass of warm water. Arthur placed the unmarked tablet on his tongue, took a large gulp of water, and swallowed loudly, but he kept the chalky pill firmly wedged between his teeth and his inner cheek. As soon as Chloe smiled her sickeningly sweet smile of false devotion and walked out of the room, Arthur rushed to the adjoining bathroom and spat the intact pill into his trembling palm. He needed to know exactly what chemical weapon they were using to systematically break his mind. He locked the heavy wooden door quietly, placed the tablet in a small glass, and crushed it using the solid handle of his shaving brush. He added a few drops of water to the white powder. A standard daily vitamin would dissolve cleanly, perhaps leaving a faint yellowish tint. This unknown substance immediately turned the water into a cloudy, murky gray sludge that clung to the bottom of the glass like toxic cement. His meticulous forensic brain instantly cataloged the physical evidence. Pulling out an incredibly old laptop he kept hidden beneath a stack of winter sweaters in his closet, he booted it up in offline mode and connected to a neighbor unsecured wireless signal, completely bypassing the monitored home network Marcus controlled. Arthur typed his exact physical symptoms into the search engine. The results cascaded down the glowing screen, confirming his absolute darkest fears. The chemical profile and the gray residue perfectly matched a heavy, black market class of powerful sedatives. These dangerous drugs were frequently utilized in elder abuse cases to forcibly induce chemical dementia, severe memory loss, and terrifying visual hallucinations. They were not trying to improve his failing health. They were actively and intentionally poisoning him. The brutal confirmation of their sheer cruelty washed over him, but there was absolutely no time left for tears or self-pity. He desperately needed an outside lifeline. His regular smartphone was undoubtedly compromised, its microphone and call logs carefully monitored by his son-in-law. Then, a sharp memory pierced through the receding chemical fog in his brain. Last Thanksgiving, his son David had pulled him aside into the cold garage. David had pressed a cheap, prepaid cellular phone into Arthur's hand, instructing him in a deadly serious tone to keep the device fully charged and hidden for absolute emergencies. Arthur had thought the young federal agent was just being excessively paranoid, but he had humored his son and tucked the small plastic device away. Arthur waited in agonizing silence until the house was completely still, the grandfather clock in the hallway chiming 1 in the morning. He crept out of his bedroom and slowly climbed the narrow, creaking wooden staircase leading up to the dark attic. The dusty attic was the only true sanctuary left in his own home. He had previously warned Marcus that the intense magnetic fields from his vintage radio collection stored up there would instantly fry any modern security cameras. Marcus, arrogant but entirely ignorant of old technology, had swallowed the lie without hesitation and left the attic unmonitored. Kneeling beneath a tarp covering old winter coats, Arthur found the small plastic box where he had hidden the prepaid device. His fingers shook violently as he powered it on. The tiny screen glowed to life, casting a pale blue light across the dusty floorboards. He dialed the only contact saved in the directory. It rang exactly twice before David answered, his voice gruff and instantly alert. Arthur poured out the entire horrifying truth to his son in rapid, hushed whispers. He detailed the gray sedative pills, the terrifying engineered hallucinations of Eleanor, the hostile financial takeover, and the blank psychiatric evaluation form for Shady Pines Behavioral Center. He fully expected David to gasp in shock, to express absolute disbelief that his own sister could commit such pure evil. Instead, a heavy, agonizing silence fell over the cellular connection. When David finally spoke, his voice was tight with suppressed rage and immense sorrow. The federal agent confessed that he already knew Marcus was a highly dangerous predator. David revealed that his bureau had been quietly tracking Marcus for over 6 months regarding a massive, multi-state elder fraud syndicate. Marcus was not a failing real estate consultant at all. He was a professional, ruthless con artist who specifically targeted wealthy, vulnerable seniors, systematically isolating them from their protective families before draining their life savings dry. David then admitted his deepest, most agonizing shame. Because Arthur was his direct blood relative, strict federal regulations regarding operational conflicts of interest completely tied his hands. David had been explicitly forbidden by his superiors from working the case or directly interfering. He warned Arthur that any unauthorized action by a family member in law enforcement would result in the entire federal investigation being thrown out of court on a procedural technicality, allowing Marcus to walk completely free and disappear with the stolen wealth. Arthur listened to his son, the jagged pieces of the puzzle locking together with terrifying clarity. Chloe was not a helpless victim married to a bad man. She was actively, willingly participating in the total destruction of her own father. David explained that the Bureau urgently needed airtight, irrefutable evidence from the inside to secure a federal search warrant before the psychiatric commitment could actually take place. They needed undeniable proof of the financial extortion and the physical poisoning. If Arthur was moved to the locked wards of Shady Pines, the legal walls would close around him permanently, and even the federal government would struggle to pull him out of the corrupt psychiatric system in time. Sitting alone in the freezing, pitch-black attic, surrounded by the forgotten relics of his past life, the retired forensic accountant made a solemn vow. The debilitating fear that had paralyzed him for weeks evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He told his son that he would get the required evidence. He would become their ultimate inside man. Arthur promised David that he would continue playing the pathetic role of the helpless, senile victim perfectly, enduring their psychological torture and fake smiles, all while secretly building an airtight forensic case against his own daughter. The trap was officially set, and Arthur was finally ready to balance the ledger. Following the covert phone call with his son, Arthur remained in the freezing attic. The illuminated face of his old wristwatch read exactly 12:13 in the morning, the precise time that would forever demarcate the end of his blind ignorance. The floorboards of the historic Colonial house were incredibly thick, but decades of shifting foundations had left a narrow, jagged crack near the central heating vent. Positioning himself flat against the dusty wood, Arthur peered down into the dimly lit living room below. The timeline of his waking nightmare had finally caught up to the very moment his heart completely shattered. Through the narrow gap, Arthur watched the heavy front door quietly unlatch. Marcus stepped inside, but he was not alone. Two massive, unfamiliar men clad in dark clothing slipped into the grand foyer behind him like silent shadows. Marcus quickly disabled the security system using the master code he had manipulated Arthur into providing just weeks ago. The three men moved with a practiced, terrifying efficiency directly toward the mahogany-paneled study. Arthur held his breath, the dust of the attic burning his lungs, as he crawled quietly to the vent position directly above his office. Looking down, he witnessed the absolute desecration of his life work. Marcus pointed toward the heavy oak bookcase. The two strangers stepped forward, effortlessly pulling the massive furniture away from the wall to reveal the steel combination safe Arthur had installed 20 years ago. They did not ask for the combination. Instead, one of the men produced a silenced, industrial-powered drill from a black canvas duffel bag. Within 15 agonizing minutes, the complex locking mechanism was utterly destroyed. Marcus reached into the metal cavity and pulled out thick manila envelopes. Even from his high vantage point, Arthur recognized the heavy parchment of his original property deeds, his wife's pristine wedding certificates, and the irreplaceable bearer bonds he had meticulously stored for his future grandchildren. Marcus shoved the priceless documents into his leather briefcase, handed a thick wad of cash to the intruders, and ushered them out into the night. Arthur lay paralyzed on the attic floor, tears of pure, undiluted betrayal soaking into the old wood. His son-in-law was not just isolating him, he was actively dismantling his estate piece by piece while he supposedly slept. The sun rose on a crisp Friday morning, casting a deceptively cheerful light over the affluent Alexandria neighborhood. Arthur slowly descended the stairs, forcing his posture to slump and his eyes to glaze over, playing the role of the heavily sedated invalid to absolute perfection. Chloe was standing in the kitchen, humming a cheerful pop tune as she poured organic coffee, looking entirely unbothered by the midnight robbery her husband had orchestrated just hours prior. Before Arthur could even touch his morning tea, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the hallway. Chloe wiped her hands on a linen towel and opened the door to reveal Martha Higgins. Martha was a 66-year-old retired emergency room nurse who had lived next door for over 3 decades. She was a fiercely intelligent woman with sharp, observant eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She stood on the porch holding a tin of freshly baked blueberry muffins, her gaze instantly darting past Chloe to lock onto Arthur shuffling aimlessly into the hallway. Martha stepped confidently over the threshold before Chloe could block her path. She approached Arthur, her clinical eyes scanning his pale complexion, the slight tremor in his hands, and the dilated pupils that were a direct result of the chemical poison he had been spitting into his bathroom sink every night. Martha spoke in a warm but probing tone, asking Arthur how he was feeling and mentioning that he looked dangerously lethargic. She gently took his wrist, her fingers resting expertly over his pulse point, and asked point-blank what new medications the private doctors had prescribed him, noting aloud that his physical symptoms strongly resembled heavy sedative toxicity. The cheerful, devoted mask on Chloe's face shattered instantly, replaced by a cold, venomous glare. She stepped sharply between her father and the retired nurse, snatching the tin of muffins from Martha's hands. Chloe dropped her voice to a low, threatening hiss. She told Martha that her father was suffering from rapid-onset dementia and that his complex medical care was being handled by exclusive private physicians. Chloe aggressively instructed the older woman to mind her own business, making it abundantly clear that neighbors stepping foot on their private property without a formal invitation would be considered trespassing and dealt with by the local authorities. Martha did not flinch. Decades of wrangling violent patients and frantic families in the trauma ward had rendered her completely immune to the petty intimidation tactics of a spoiled, predatory daughter. She held her ground for a fraction of a second, her sharp eyes locking intensely with Arthur. In that fleeting moment, Arthur let his vacant, drug-addled expression drop entirely. He looked at Martha with absolute, terrifying clarity. He needed her to know he was trapped, but completely sane. Martha's breath hitched ever so slightly as she registered the profound lucidity burning in his aging eyes. She understood the silent plea instantly. Feigning a clumsy stumble as Chloe aggressively pushed her toward the open doorway, Martha reached out and grasped Arthur's trembling hand to steady herself. In one swift, masterful motion of sleight of hand, she pressed a small, cold, jagged piece of metal deep into his palm. She loudly apologized for her clumsiness, wishing Arthur a speedy recovery, and allowed Chloe to slam the heavy wooden door shut right in her face. Arthur stood perfectly still in the hallway as Chloe launched into a furious tirade about nosy, pathetic old women who had nothing better to do than harass grieving families. He nodded slowly, letting his shoulders slump back into the posture of a broken man, muttering a confused apology to placate his enraged daughter. But beneath the fragile facade, his heart was beating with a renewed, fierce determination. He slipped his hand deep into the pocket of his wool cardigan, his fingers tightly tracing the jagged teeth of the spare house key Martha had just smuggled to him. He finally had a physical lifeline to the outside world, a safe harbor located just 50 yards across the manicured lawn. The walls of his golden cage were incredibly thick, but for the first time in long agonizing months, Arthur Pendelton possessed the key to open a door. That cold, jagged piece of metal resting in his palm was not merely a spare house key, it was the very first weapon in Arthur Pendelton's quiet war of retribution. He waited in the suffocating silence of his bedroom until the digital clock on his nightstand read 2 in the morning. Confident that his daughter and her husband were deeply asleep in the guest wing, Arthur slipped silently out of bed and made his familiar, calculated ascent to the unmonitored attic. He pulled the prepaid cellular device from its hiding place beneath the winter coats and waited for the faint blue glow of the screen to illuminate his determined face. His decades of experience hunting down elusive corporate embezzlers had taught him that building an airtight case required irrefutable, independently verifiable evidence. He could not simply tell the federal authorities what was happening, he had to show them. Navigating the slow internet browser on the burner phone, Arthur searched the darkest corners of the web for professional-grade surveillance equipment. He bypassed the cheap, easily detectable commercial cameras and found a specialized micro-lens device designed for private investigators. It featured motion activation, high-definition video capture, crisp audio recording capabilities, and a secure, encrypted cloud upload function that would stream data directly to a hidden server. He purchased the equipment using a highly untraceable digital gift card David had preloaded onto the device months ago. For the shipping destination, he carefully typed in the home address of Martha Higgins. Communicating his plan to the retired nurse without raising suspicion required an old-fashioned, analog approach. The following morning, Chloe forced Arthur out onto the back patio for his strictly monitored 10 minutes of fresh air. Arthur wrapped a thick wool blanket tightly around his shoulders, shuffling his feet and staring blankly at the frost-covered grass. As he shuffled near the property line separating his yard from Martha's, he intentionally let his blanket slip from his shoulders to the ground. As he painfully bent down to retrieve the fabric, his shoe kicked a tightly folded piece of paper through the wooden fence slats, burying it perfectly into Martha's dormant rosebush bed. The handwritten note simply begged her to hold a small package arriving under a fake name and to leave it on her kitchen counter. 3 agonizing days crawled by. Arthur continued his degrading performance, swallowing water while expertly hiding the toxic gray sedatives in his cheek, only to spit them down the drain the moment he was alone. On the fourth night, a brief text message illuminated the burner phone screen confirming the package had been delivered. At 3 in the morning, Arthur executed his retrieval plan. Marcus had installed the interior cameras hastily, arrogantly assuming Arthur was too sedated to notice anything. But Arthur had spent hours mapping the exact visual arcs of every single lens. There was a narrow, 2-foot-wide blind spot running tightly along the baseboards of the rear hallway leading directly to the back patio door. Dropping to his hands and knees, the 69-year-old man crawled through the shadows, moving with a desperate, silent agility he had not possessed in years. He slipped through the back door and crossed the freezing, moonlit lawn to Martha's back porch. His trembling fingers guided the jagged spare key into her deadbolt. The lock clicked softly. There, sitting perfectly illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the kitchen window, was a small brown box. Beneath it was a torn piece of paper with a message written in Martha's elegant cursive handwriting that simply read, "Make them pay." Arthur secured the box against his chest, retraced his perilous path through the freezing night, and slipped back into his bedroom completely undetected. The perfect opportunity for installation arrived the very next afternoon. Chloe and Marcus announced they were leaving for a 2-hour lunch appointment in the city to discuss urgent real estate matters. The moment their luxury sedan pulled out of the long driveway, Arthur dropped the senile act entirely. He carried the small black surveillance kit into the grand living room. His forensic eyes scanned the sprawling space, finally locking onto the towering antique grandfather clock standing proudly against the far wall. The magnificent wooden timepiece had been in Eleanor's family for generations. It stood directly facing the plush velvet sofa where his daughter and son-in-law spent every single evening drinking expensive wine and casually plotting his institutionalization. Marcus completely ignored the clock, viewing the antique as an annoying relic because it required manual winding, a chore Arthur still painstakingly performed every Sunday as part of his supposed therapeutic routine. Arthur opened the tall glass door of the clock housing. He needed absolute, flawless precision. He carefully removed the ornate brass hands and gently detached the painted wooden faceplate. As he worked, his breathing slowed to a calm, rhythmic pace. The severe, exaggerated tremors he constantly faked for Chloe vanished entirely. His hands became rock steady, transforming back into the surgical instruments of a master forensic accountant who had spent 40 years dissecting microscopic discrepancies in tens of thousands of fraudulent corporate ledgers. Using a tiny hand drill from a hidden toolkit he had smuggled down from the attic, Arthur bored a microscopic hole, no larger than a pinhead, directly through the dark center of the Roman numeral 12. He carefully mounted the micro-lens behind the tiny aperture, securing the compact battery pack and the wireless transmitter deep within the hollow wooden casing, safely hidden away from the rhythmic swing of the heavy brass pendulum. He reassembled the clock face flawlessly, ensuring not a single screw or speck of sawdust was left out of place. Wiping a single bead of sweat from his deeply lined forehead, Arthur retreated to the safety of the attic and powered on the burner phone. He accessed the encrypted cloud server and held his breath. A crisp, high-definition live video feed flickered onto the small screen. The viewing angle was absolutely perfect, capturing the entirety of the living room sofa. A moment later, the hidden microphone crackled to life, picking up the heavy, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock with crystal-clear clarity. Arthur smiled a cold, humorless smile in the shadows of the attic. The invisible trap was now fully armed, and the clock was officially ticking down the final hours of his daughter's cruel reign. The very next morning provided the perfect window of opportunity for the retired investigator to strike. Marcus and Chloe departed for a prolonged brunch at the local country club, a lavish, unnecessary expense funded entirely by Arthur's stolen credit cards. As soon as the sound of their heavy luxury engine faded down the long gravel driveway, Arthur dropped his frail, hunched posture. He walked briskly into the home office Marcus had aggressively claimed and locked the heavy oak door behind him. The sleek silver laptop sat squarely on the mahogany desk, acting as the digital vault for their entire conspiracy. Arthur flipped the screen open. A password prompt immediately blocked his path. Marcus was deeply arrogant, the exact kind of man who believed himself to be the smartest person in any given room, which usually meant his security protocols were predictably lazy. Arthur closed his eyes, thinking like the narcissistic predator he was hunting. He typed in the word empire followed by Marcus's birth year. The screen blinked, the digital lock icon dissolved, and a pristine desktop appeared. Arthur did not waste a single second of his precious time. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the blinding speed and absolute precision of a maestro returning to his piano. He bypassed the superficial decoy folders and dug straight into the hidden, encrypted directories. Within 10 minutes, he uncovered the master financial spreadsheets. As a forensic accountant who had spent decades unraveling the most complex corporate frauds on Wall Street, deciphering Marcus's clumsy, brute force money laundering scheme took almost no effort at all. It was a textbook, albeit highly aggressive, asset-stripping operation. He found the digital paper trail mapping out the creation of 3 anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware. Attached to these phantom entities were pending wire transfers designed to instantly drain Arthur's liquid assets, liquidate his diverse stock portfolio, and remortgage the historic Colonial home the exact moment a judge signed the medical incompetency order. The total projected sum hovered just over $5 million. Every single cent he and Eleanor had painstakingly saved over 40 years of grueling work was meticulously scheduled to vanish into the ether. Arthur pulled a tiny, encrypted thumb drive from his pocket, a specialized tool David had included in a hidden package with the burner phone, and initiated a stealth mass copy of the entire hard drive. He watched the green progress bar inch forward, his heart cold and incredibly steady. He was no longer a grieving, helpless father. He was an apex auditor executing a terminal investigation. With the stolen data securely copied and the laptop meticulously wiped of his digital fingerprints, Arthur retreated upstairs. He slipped the thumb drive into a hollowed-out cavity behind a loose brick in the attic wall. As darkness fell over Alexandria, he smoothly resumed his role as the heavily medicated invalid. He endured another humiliating dinner where Chloe patronizingly spoon-fed him soup and sneaked the toxic gray pill onto his tray. He performed his nightly routine of pretending to swallow, spitting the poison into the bathroom drain, and silently climbing the creaking stairs to his hidden command center. At 9:45 that evening, the grandfather clock camera triggered a silent motion alert on his prepaid device. Arthur pressed his earbud tightly into his ear and stared intently at the glowing screen. Chloe and Marcus were lounging on the plush velvet sofa directly in the camera's unblinking line of sight. Chloe held a crystal glass of expensive red wine, her legs draped casually over her husband's lap. The hidden microphone picked up their voices with terrifying, crystal-clear precision, accompanied only by the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the antique clock. Marcus swirled his bourbon, leaning his head back against the cushions with a heavy sigh. He asked Chloe if the medical arrangements for the upcoming weekend were fully finalized. Chloe took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her beautiful face settling into a mask of pure, chilling indifference. She stated that Dr. Silas Thorne was scheduled to arrive on Friday afternoon. She assured Marcus that the doctor had already drafted the psychiatric evaluation report, pre-filling the clinical diagnosis with severe dementia and highly aggressive paranoid psychosis. Marcus chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that made Arthur's stomach violently turn. Marcus asked if the doctor was satisfied with the compensation they had discussed. Chloe smiled, a razor-thin, completely soulless curve of her lips, and confirmed that $50,000 in untraceable cash was ready and waiting in the basement safe. She explicitly detailed how the massive bribe would absolutely guarantee the doctor's signature on the involuntary commitment order, granting them absolute legal and medical power of attorney by Monday morning without a single question from the state authorities. Arthur sat frozen in a freezing attic, listening to his only daughter casually price his permanent institutionalization at $50,000. She spoke about locking him away in the sterile, heavily medicated, locked wards of Shady Pines with the exact same casual, breezy tone one might use to discuss hiring a weekend landscaping service. There was absolutely no hesitation in her voice, no lingering guilt over destroying the father who had given her everything she had ever wanted. The irrefutable video file processed and uploaded directly to the secure federal cloud server, cementing the physical proof David desperately needed. Arthur lowered the phone, the last fragile, desperate thread of his paternal denial snapping completely. The sweet little girl who used to sit on his lap and pretend to read his ledgers was truly dead, entirely replaced by a venomous, greedy stranger, and Arthur knew exactly what he had to do to tear her fraudulent empire to the ground. The quiet Wednesday afternoon settled heavily over the sprawling Colonial estate. Marcus had announced his departure for a late lunch meeting downtown, leaving Chloe ostensibly alone to monitor her supposedly incapacitated father. Arthur, perfectly adhering to his rigid schedule of feigned senility, had shuffled off to his bedroom for a mandatory afternoon nap. However, the moment he heard the heavy deadbolt secure the front door behind his son-in-law, Arthur slipped out of his bed and silently ascended the creaking staircase to the dusty attic. He powered on the prepaid cellular device, his thumbs tapping the encrypted icon to access the live feed from the grandfather clock. On the small glowing screen, the grand living room appeared utterly tranquil. Chloe sat on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, but her usual posture of arrogant boredom had entirely vanished. She was nervously smoothing the fabric of her expensive silk dress, her eyes darting constantly toward the grand foyer. 10 minutes passed in absolute silence, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the antique clock echoing through the hidden microphone. Then, the heavy oak front door swung open. Arthur leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The man who stepped into the foyer was not Marcus. He was a tall, sharply dressed stranger with impeccably styled dark hair and a tailored charcoal suit that screamed quiet, illicit wealth. He moved with a predatory, effortless confidence that Marcus entirely lacked. Chloe leaped from the sofa, her face illuminating with a radiant, genuine joy that Arthur had not seen since her early 20s. She rushed across the room and threw her arms around the stranger's neck, pulling him into a deep, passionate kiss. It was not the polite, performative affection she routinely showed her husband. This was raw, untamed infatuation. Arthur sat frozen in the freezing shadows of the attic, his forensic mind scrambling to process the shocking visual evidence. They broke apart, and the stranger wrapped a possessive arm around his daughter's waist, guiding her back to the velvet sofa perfectly centered in the camera frame. Chloe poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch, handing one to the man as she curled intimately into his side. She looked up at him with absolute adoration and called him Julian. Julian Hayes took a slow sip of the amber liquid, his dark eyes scanning the opulent living room with a look of supreme satisfaction. He asked Chloe if the fool had suspected anything before leaving the house. Chloe laughed, a bright, melodic sound that chilled Arthur to his very bones. She assured Julian that Marcus was completely oblivious, blinded by his own pathetic arrogance and his desperate need to clear his massive gambling debts. Listening through the encrypted earpiece, Arthur felt the solid foundation of his reality shatter for the second time. The conversation flowing from the hidden microphone completely rewrote the entire narrative of his captivity. This was not a hastily concocted scheme driven by an opportunistic son-in-law. As Julian gently stroked Chloe's hair, they began to openly discuss the intricate architecture of their true master plan. Julian praised Chloe for her incredible patience, reminding her that they had been carefully building this trap for 3 long years. 3 years. The revelation struck Arthur like a physical blow. Chloe had been conspiring with this sophisticated criminal long before Eleanor even fell ill. Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping into a smooth, calculating baritone. He meticulously reviewed the financial sequence. He confirmed that the offshore trust accounts in the Cayman Islands were fully operational and waiting to receive the $5 million wire transfer. Chloe nodded eagerly, her eyes shining with the promise of unbridled luxury. She asked Julian to confirm that Marcus would not be able to follow the money trail once the accounts were drained. Julian smiled a cold, shark-like smile. He explained the brilliant, sinister beauty of their setup. He detailed how every single shell company, every forged property deed, and every illegal bank transfer bore the exclusive digital signature and physical handwriting of Marcus. They had intentionally selected Marcus as Chloe's husband specifically because he was financially desperate, morally bankrupt, and incredibly easy to manipulate. Marcus was never meant to be the mastermind, he was the designated scapegoat. When the massive theft was inevitably discovered by the federal authorities, the entire paper trail would lead directly and undeniably to Marcus. Chloe rested her head against Julian's shoulder, sighing with profound contentment. She painted a vivid picture of the impending aftermath. She would play the role of the devastated, victimized wife who had no idea her evil husband was systematically poisoning her beloved father and stealing his vast estate. Marcus would be dragged away in federal handcuffs, facing decades in a maximum security prison for elder abuse and grand larceny. Meanwhile, Arthur would be securely locked away in the sterile, heavily medicated confines of Shady Pines Behavioral Center, stripped of his mind and his voice. Once the dust settled, Chloe would quietly divorce the incarcerated Marcus, pack her designer bags, and permanently disappear to a pristine beach in the Cayman Islands to live like royalty with Julian. Arthur stared at the glowing screen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the prepaid phone. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his daughter's malevolence was almost incomprehensible. She was not just robbing him, she was orchestrating the complete, total annihilation of 2 different men without a single shred of remorse. She was a master manipulator, pulling the strings of a deadly psychological puppet show while maintaining the innocent facade of a grieving child. The live video feed continued to stream, the high-definition lens capturing every single damning word, every passionate kiss, and every arrogant laugh. The encrypted data flowed silently through the digital ether, landing directly on the secure federal servers monitored by his son David. Arthur did not weep. The profound sorrow that had weighed down his soul for 8 agonizing months completely burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, indestructible titanium. He slowly lowered the cellular device, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock echoing in his ears like a solemn countdown. They believed they had engineered the perfect, airtight crime. They believed they had successfully outsmarted a brilliant forensic accountant by turning his own mind against him. But as Arthur sat in the darkness, a deadly calm washed over his aging frame. He knew exactly how to dismantle their Grand Cayman escape, and he was going to make sure the trap they had so carefully built would snap shut on their own necks. The fateful Friday afternoon arrived draped in thick, gray rain clouds that cast long, mournful shadows across the polished mahogany floors of the Colonial estate. Arthur sat rigidly in his wingback chair in the living room, wearing a slightly oversized knitted cardigan and a vacant, slack-jawed expression. He had spent the entire morning rehearsing this precise performance. The hidden micro-lens buried deep within the face of the antique grandfather clock was actively transmitting every single frame to the secure federal cloud. The trap was fully armed, and the primary target was about to walk right through the front door. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker sounded. Chloe rushed to the foyer, her face instantly transforming into a masterclass of pained, exhausted daughterly devotion. She opened the door to admit Dr. Silas Thorne. The psychiatrist stepped into the entryway, shaking the rain from his expensive tailored trench coat. He was a sharply dressed man in his late 50s with slicked-back silver hair, a forced, sympathetic smile, and cold, entirely dead eyes. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase that Arthur knew contained the pre-written, fraudulent documents designed to strip away his human rights. Marcus emerged from his home office, extending a firm hand to greet the corrupt physician. They exchanged brief, coded pleasantries before Chloe guided Dr. Thorne into the living room. Arthur did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed blindly on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, letting his hands tremble subtly in his lap. He was channeling every ounce of his grief, his exhaustion, and his forensic discipline into playing the pathetic, broken victim they all desperately needed him to be. Dr. Thorne pulled up a high-backed chair directly across from Arthur, placing his briefcase on the coffee table. The angle was absolutely flawless. The grandfather clock looked down upon the entire arrangement, capturing every face and every subtle gesture. Thorne leaned forward, adopting a tone of cloying, artificial gentleness. He asked Arthur how he was feeling, his voice dripping with condescension. Arthur blinked slowly, letting his eyes drift aimlessly around the room before finally settling on the doctor. He slurred his words intentionally, whispering that his head felt incredibly full of thick cotton. He mentioned that the shadows in the corners of the house were constantly moving. Thorne immediately pulled a gold-plated pen from his breast pocket and began scribbling aggressively on a notepad, though Arthur knew the actual diagnosis had been typed up days ago. The questions continued, specifically designed to be highly leading and manipulative. Thorne asked if Arthur ever saw people who were no longer living. Arthur let a single, perfect tear slide down his weathered cheek. He looked toward the empty archway of the dining room and murmured that Eleanor had visited him just the night before, wearing her blue dress, but she refused to speak to him. Chloe let out a perfectly timed, stifled sob from the sofa, burying her face in Marcus' shoulder. Marcus rubbed her back, playing the supportive husband while his eyes locked hungrily onto the psychiatrist pen. Thorne asked Arthur to identify the current year and the name of the president. Arthur intentionally provided the year his wife was first diagnosed with cancer and named a politician who had been out of office for over a decade. He watched the absolute satisfaction bloom behind the doctor's cold eyes. After a mere 15 minutes of this theatrical sham, Dr. Thorne closed his notepad with a heavy, dramatic sigh. He turned to face the supposedly devastated couple sitting on the velvet sofa. The psychiatrist stated in a grave, authoritative voice that the cognitive decline was incredibly severe and progressing at an alarming rate. He diagnosed Arthur with advanced paranoid psychosis coupled with aggressive, drug-resistant dementia. He looked directly at Chloe, asserting that Arthur was an active danger to himself and completely incapable of managing his complex medical or financial affairs. He declared that immediate transfer to a specialized, secure care facility was not just recommended, but an absolute medical necessity. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with fake, silent weeping. Marcus stood up, his face set in an expression of grim determination, and asked Dr. Thorne what the next legal steps entailed. The doctor placed his black briefcase flat on the glass coffee table and snapped the brass latches open. He produced a thick stack of legal documents bearing the sinister letterhead of Shady Pines Behavioral Center. Thorne explained that these were the involuntary commitment orders, completely granting Marcus and Chloe full medical and financial power of attorney. He noted that he had already taken the liberty of backdating the extensive evaluation logs by 3 full weeks to establish a documented history of severe decline, ensuring that no state judge would ever question the sudden emergency transfer. Arthur remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, while his hidden camera captured the ultimate exchange. Marcus reached deep into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a remarkably thick, unmarked manila envelope. The envelope was bulging, packed tightly with $50,000 in untraceable $100 bills. Marcus handed the illicit package directly to Dr. Silas Thorne. The psychiatrist did not even bother to count it. He simply tested the hefty weight of the envelope in his palm, offered a greasy, conspiratorial smile, and slipped the bribe seamlessly into his black leather briefcase alongside his stethoscope. In return, Thorne slid the signed, fraudulent commitment orders across the glass table. Marcus picked up the papers, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. He had just purchased the legal keys to a $5 million estate, entirely unaware that his wife was planning to leave him to face the federal fallout alone. Dr. Thorne stood up, offered a final, hollow condolence to the treacherous daughter, and walked out the front door into the pouring rain. Arthur continued to stare at the blank wall, his hands resting limply in his lap. The sham evaluation was officially over. The corrupt doctor had been paid, the illegal documents were signed, and the physical evidence was now safely encrypted on a federal server. They had successfully built his coffin, but Arthur knew with absolute certainty that they were the ones who were going to be buried in it. The storm outside mirrored the escalating tension inside the Colonial estate. As the taillights of Dr. Thorne luxury sedan faded into the pouring rain, Chloe did not relax. Instead, she began pacing the length of the grand living room, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She stopped at the heavy bay window, peering through the rain-streaked glass toward the neighboring property. Martha Higgins was standing on her own covered porch, her arms crossed, staring directly at Arthur House. The retired emergency room nurse had not backed down. Her silent, unyielding vigilance was severely rattling Chloe's normally ice-cold composure. Chloe turned away from the window, her face pale and drawn tight with sudden paranoia. She walked over to Marcus, who was still admiring the fraudulent commitment orders on the glass coffee table. She snatched the papers directly from his hands, declaring in a sharp, trembling voice that they were completely out of time. Marcus looked bewildered, protesting that the transfer to Shady Pines Behavioral Center was securely scheduled for the following Wednesday. Chloe shook her head vehemently. She hissed that the nosy old woman next door was getting entirely too suspicious. If Martha decided to call Adult Protective Services or the local police over the weekend, the authorities might launch an impromptu welfare check. A state-appointed doctor might demand a second opinion, unraveling their entire 3-year conspiracy in a single instant. Chloe demanded that they move her father tomorrow. Marcus argued fiercely, pointing out that it would cost a small fortune to book a discreet private medical transport on such incredibly short notice. Chloe shot back that a few extra $1,000 was absolutely nothing compared to losing a $5 million estate. She ordered Marcus to make the phone call immediately, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Up in the freezing attic, Arthur pressed his earpiece deeper into his ear, his breath turning to white mist in the cold air. He listened as Marcus dialed the number for a shadow medical transport company, a corrupt outfit known for asking zero questions as long as the cash was plentiful. Marcus negotiated aggressively, finally securing a specialized extraction team. Arthur heard Marcus explicitly instruct the dispatchers to arrive at exactly 5:45 in the morning on Saturday. It was a calculated, predatory hour, chosen specifically because the sun would not yet be up and the nosy neighbors would still be fast asleep. They planned to drag Arthur out of his bed and haul him away in the dark like a piece of unwanted garbage. Arthur did not panic. The forensic accountant inside him recognized that a compressed timeline simply meant the enemy was prone to making fatal, sloppy mistakes. The moment Marcus ended the phone call, Arthur went to work. He retrieved the encrypted thumb drive from the loose brick in the wall and connected it to his prepaid cellular device. With methodical, unshakable precision, he initiated a secure data transfer. The massive files containing the stolen financial ledgers, the damning video of Chloe kissing Julian Hayes, and the irrefutable audio recording of Dr. Silas Thorne accepting the $50,000 cash bribe all flowed silently into the secure federal cloud server. Once the upload progress bar hit 100%, Arthur dialed his son. David answered on the very first ring. Arthur spoke in a low, rapid whisper, informing the federal agent that the timeline had radically shifted. The medical transport was arriving in less than 12 hours, specifically at 5:45 in the morning. A heavy, highly charged silence filled the cellular connection. When David spoke again, his voice was stripped of any remaining familial warmth, replaced entirely by the icy, commanding tone of a federal investigator. He confirmed that the Bureau had successfully received and verified the uploaded evidence. The mountain of digital proof was more than enough to bypass the local judges and secure immediate, heavily armed federal intervention. David instructed his father to remain in his bedroom and maintain the facade of the heavily sedated invalid until the very last possible second. David promised that his tactical team would breach the perimeter before the fake paramedics could ever lay a single hand on him. Arthur agreed to the parameters, but he secretly formed a secondary plan of his own. He was not going to simply cower beneath his blankets waiting to be rescued. He wanted to look his treacherous daughter in the eyes when her golden empire crumbled into dust. Arthur disconnected the call and powered down the burner phone. He moved quietly to his hidden stash of electronics and pulled out an old, fully charged digital tablet he had previously used for reading financial journals. He downloaded a very specific, carefully trimmed video file directly from the secure cloud onto the tablet local memory. He adjusted the volume to its maximum setting and propped the sleek digital device on his nightstand. As the antique grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight, Arthur lay down on his mattress, his eyes wide open in the dark. He did not sleep a single wink. He simply listened to the heavy rain beating against the bedroom windowpane, his heart beating with a steady, fierce rhythm. The golden cage they had built for him was about to become their permanent prison. Arthur folded his hands over his chest, waiting patiently for the violent dawn that would finally bring his absolute, uncompromising justice. The cold, damp dawn crept over the historic Alexandria neighborhood, bleeding a pale gray light through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom. Arthur stood perfectly still in the deepest shadows near his en-suite bathroom, the digital tablet clutched firmly in his hands. The digital clock on his nightstand shifted from 5:44 to 5:45 in the morning. Right on the very second, the distinct, heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the oppressive silence of the house. They had arrived. Downstairs, the heavy deadbolt clicked open. Arthur heard the hushed, urgent whispers of his daughter and her husband as they greeted the shadow medical extraction team. Heavy, unpolished boots scuffed against the hardwood floors in the foyer. Marcus spoke in a low, commanding voice, instructing the men to move quickly and quietly before the old man could wake up and cause a scene. Chloe chimed in, her voice chirping with artificial anxiety, reminding the team to use the heavy liquid sedative immediately if her father tried to resist the transport. The synchronized footsteps began their ascent up the creaking wooden staircase. Arthur took a deep, steadying breath. He let the hunched, fragile posture he had maintained for agonizing months completely fall away. He rolled his shoulders back, standing at his full height. His mind was incredibly sharp, free from the toxic gray pills he had been secretly spitting out, and completely focused on the imminent confrontation. The brass doorknob of the master bedroom turned slowly. The door swung open, revealing two massive men dressed in generic, unbranded medical scrubs. The larger of the two held a thick plastic syringe filled with a clear, highly potent liquid, his thumb hovering lazily over the plunger. Marcus and Chloe crowded into the doorway directly behind the fake paramedics, their faces pale and drawn tight with the stress of their final, treacherous act. They expected to find the heavily medicated, terrified elderly man cowering beneath the heavy winter blankets. Instead, they found an empty, perfectly made bed. Arthur stepped out of the dark shadows, his posture rigidly straight and his eyes burning with absolute, terrifying clarity. He looked directly at the intruders and stated in a calm, unwavering voice that they were completely trespassing. The two burly medics froze instantly, exchanging a look of profound confusion. Marcus pushed his way past them into the bedroom, his initial shock quickly morphing into aggressive panic. He pointed a trembling finger at his father-in-law and loudly ordered the medics to grab the old man, desperately shouting that Arthur was experiencing a severe, aggressive psychotic episode and needed to be chemically restrained immediately. Arthur did not retreat a single inch. He raised the digital tablet high in the air and firmly pressed the glowing play button. He had turned the volume to its absolute maximum setting. The pristine audio of the secretly recorded video instantly flooded the tense bedroom. Chloe's bright, melodic voice echoed off the walls, clearly asking Julian Hayes to confirm that Marcus would not be able to follow the money trail once the offshore trust accounts in the Cayman Islands were fully drained. Julian's smooth, baritone response followed immediately, detailing the brilliant, sinister beauty of their setup. The hidden microphone perfectly broadcasted Julian explaining how every single forged property deed and illegal bank transfer bore the exclusive digital signature of Marcus. Julian declared loudly that Marcus was never meant to be the master planner, but merely the designated, heavily indebted scapegoat who would rot in a federal maximum security prison while Julian and Chloe escaped with the $5 million estate. The recording captured Chloe laughing with pure, unadulterated joy at the prospect of her husband's imminent incarceration. The audio echoed into sudden, suffocating silence. The color completely drained from Marcus' face, leaving him looking like a bloodless corpse. His eyes, wide with sheer, uncomprehending horror, slowly moved from the digital screen in Arthur's hands to the face of his beloved wife standing in the doorway. Chloe stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet. She stammered wildly, her hands raised in a desperate, pathetic attempt to calm the situation, wildly claiming that the video was a deep fake fabrication. But Marcus knew her true voice, and he knew the incredibly specific, damning financial details the stranger on the recording had just effortlessly outlined. The realization that he had been ruthlessly played for 3 long years finally shattered Marcus entirely. A guttural, animalistic scream of pure rage tore from his throat. He lunged violently across the room, completely ignoring the confused paramedics, and tackled his wife to the floor. They crashed heavily against the hallway wall, Marcus wrapping his hands around the collar of her silk blouse, screaming that she had ruined his entire life. The two fake medics stepped back in sheer panic, realizing instantly that they had walked directly into a massive, highly volatile domestic conspiracy rather than a simple medical extraction. Right as Marcus raised his fist to strike the woman who had condemned him to federal prison, a deafening, thunderous crash shook the entire foundation of the historic Colonial house. Downstairs, the heavy oak front door was violently battered off its iron hinges, splintering into countless jagged pieces across the grand foyer. The booming, synchronized thunder of heavy tactical boots swarmed the bottom floor. A booming voice amplified by a megaphone echoed up the stairwell, demanding that absolutely everyone freeze and put their hands exactly where they could be seen. David materialized at the top of the staircase like an avenging angel. He was clad in full federal tactical gear, his protective vest emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Bureau, and his service weapon drawn and perfectly leveled. A dozen heavily armed federal agents flooded the upstairs hallway directly behind him. The agents swarmed the screaming couple on the floor, effortlessly ripping Marcus away from Chloe. They shoved the treacherous husband face down into the carpet, violently ratcheting heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Two other agents hoisted a sobbing, hysterical Chloe to her feet, tightly restraining her arms behind her back. The fake paramedics immediately dropped to their knees, raising their hands high in the air and desperately begging for mercy. David lowered his weapon and stepped slowly into the master bedroom. He looked at the chaos unfolding in the hallway, the perpetrators of the insidious crime finally bound and captured. Then, the federal agent turned his gaze to the 69-year-old retired forensic accountant standing tall and victorious in the center of the room. David offered a small, immensely proud nod. Arthur lowered the digital tablet, a profound wave of relief finally washing over his tired soul. The trap had been flawlessly sprung, and the very first architects of his misery were finally in chains. The chaos in the upstairs hallway finally settled into a tense, heavy silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the captured predators. Marcus knelt on the carpet, his head bowed, the fight completely drained from his body as the horrifying reality of his impending incarceration crushed his spirit. Chloe, however, thrashed wildly against the strong grips of the federal agents. Her designer silk blouse was torn, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. She locked her furious, venomous eyes onto Arthur, screaming that he was a delusional old fool, desperately clinging to the crumbling fragments of her shattered innocent facade. Arthur did not raise his voice. He stepped calmly over the threshold of the master bedroom and walked directly toward his daughter. He reached into the deep pocket of her silk skirt and smoothly extracted her sleek smartphone. Chloe froze, a sudden, cold panic washing over her previously enraged features. She demanded to know what he was doing, but Arthur simply looked at his son. David nodded, signaling the tactical team to yank Chloe and Marcus to their feet and drag them roughly down the wooden staircase. In the destroyed grand foyer, Arthur stood beside David. The forensic accountant tapped the illuminated screen of his daughter's mobile device. He had spent weeks watching the grandfather clock camera feed, meticulously memorizing the exact 6-digit passcode Chloe used every single time she texted her secret lover. He entered the numbers flawlessly. The device unlocked, revealing a long, damning thread of encrypted messages between Chloe and Julian Hayes. Arthur looked at his son and stated that they were missing the final, most poisonous snake in the grass. David immediately instructed his heavily armed team to clear the living room and conceal themselves in the deep shadows of the adjoining dining room and kitchen. They forced Chloe and Marcus into the heavy oak chairs in the study, securing them completely out of sight with imposing federal agents standing directly over them to ensure absolute silence. Arthur typed a brief, highly calculated message to Julian. He wrote that the medical transport had successfully departed, the old man was permanently locked away, and the coast was entirely clear. He urged Julian to come to the Colonial estate immediately so they could pop the champagne and finalize their grand escape to the Cayman Islands. He hit send and waited. Less than 2 minutes later, 3 glowing dots appeared on the screen, followed by a swift, eager reply. Julian confirmed he was already on his way and would arrive in exactly 20 minutes. The Alexandria estate transformed into a silent, heavily armed trap. The federal agents blended perfectly into the dark corners of the historic house. Arthur took his seat in the center of the living room, settling comfortably onto the plush velvet sofa where his treacherous daughter had spent countless evenings plotting his demise. Directly across from him, the antique grandfather clock ticked with a heavy, rhythmic finality, its hidden camera still recording every single frame. Exactly 20 minutes later, the smooth purr of a high-performance Italian sports car rolled up the gravel driveway. A heavy car door slammed shut. Confident, echoing footsteps quickly approached the front porch. Since the tactical team had already battered the front door completely off its hinges, Julian Hayes simply stepped through the ruined entryway, utterly oblivious to the massive danger lurking in the dark shadows. Julian walked into the grand living room holding a chilled bottle of vintage champagne in his right hand. He wore a crisp, tailored designer suit, his handsome face glowing with the arrogant, sickening triumph of a man who believed he had just effortlessly stolen a $5 million empire. He called out Chloe's name, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space, fully expecting his beautiful accomplice to run excitedly into his arms. Instead, Julian stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting perfectly upright on the velvet sofa, his hands resting calmly on his knees, was Arthur Pendelton. The supposedly sedated, hopelessly demented old man was staring back at him with eyes as sharp and cold as freshly cut diamonds. Julian's jaw dropped. The expensive champagne bottle slipped from his pristine fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. A frothy pool of alcohol and green glass exploded across the fine Persian rug. Julian stammered, frantically scanning the room, his predatory instincts finally screaming that he had walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. He turned swiftly on his heel, preparing to sprint back out the ruined front door into the pouring rain. He did not make it a single step. David materialized from the dining room shadows like a phantom, leveling his Federal Service weapon directly at Julian's chest. A dozen tactical lasers instantly painted bright red dots across the tailored charcoal suit. David announced in a booming, uncompromising voice that Julian Hayes was under arrest for grand larceny, criminal conspiracy, and severe elder abuse. Julian raised his hands slowly, his arrogant facade crumbling into pure, pathetic terror. Two tactical agents surged forward, tackling the mastermind violently to the floor directly in front of the shattered champagne bottle. They twisted his arms forcefully behind his back, the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut with a profound, echoing finality. Arthur stood up from the sofa and walked slowly toward the pinned criminal. Julian looked up, his face pressed painfully against the wet hardwood, desperately trying to understand how his brilliant 3-year masterpiece had failed so catastrophically. Arthur leaned down, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the crushing weight of absolute victory. He told Julian that numbers never lie, and a forensic accountant always balances his final ledger. The agents hauled Julian to his feet, dragging him roughly toward the waiting federal vehicles outside. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the dark morning, casting erratic shadows across the walls of the living room. The grand conspiracy had completely dissolved, its wicked architects thoroughly broken and bound. Above the shattered glass and the chaotic aftermath, the antique grandfather clock continued its steady, metallic ticking, bearing silent witness to the exact moment Arthur Pendelton triumphantly reclaimed his life and his home. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud, echoing the absolute finality of the justice that had finally been served. Exactly 1 year after the violent dawn raid at the Colonial estate, Arthur Pendelton sat in the front row of the gallery, his posture immaculate and his heart finally at peace. The mountain of irrefutable digital evidence he had meticulously gathered from the attic and the antique grandfather clock had completely decimated the defense. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for those who preyed upon the vulnerable, delivered the crushing sentences without a single ounce of mercy. Dr. Silas Thorne was stripped of his medical license permanently and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for medical malpractice, bribery, and severe elder abuse. The corrupt gates of Shady Pines Behavioral Center were chained and padlocked by state authorities, the facility completely shut down and its captive patients safely relocated to legitimate care centers. Marcus, the arrogant son-in-law who thought he could steal a $5 million empire, wept openly as he received a 15-year sentence, finally realizing the true cost of his blinding greed. Julian Hayes, the sophisticated mastermind who had orchestrated the massive offshore money laundering operation, was handed 25 years behind bars, his arrogant smirk entirely erased by the crushing weight of federal mandates. But the heaviest silence in the courtroom fell when Chloe was brought before the judge. For orchestrating the systematic poisoning, the psychological torture, and the attempted institutionalization of her own grieving father, Chloe was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security facility. When she turned to look at Arthur one final time, her eyes pleading for a forgiveness she absolutely did not deserve, Arthur simply looked away. The ledger was officially balanced, and the toxic debt was paid in full. Returning to the sprawling Alexandria estate, Arthur realized the historic walls held too many painful ghosts. The house where he had loved Eleanor and raised his children had been irreversibly tainted by betrayal. He sold the grand Colonial home and purchased a bright, welcoming cottage in a quiet neighborhood just a few miles down the road from his son David. Surrounded by the joyful laughter of his grandchildren, Arthur found the profound healing he so desperately needed. He did not let his brilliant mind go to waste. Utilizing his 4 decades of forensic accounting expertise, Arthur established a legal defense foundation dedicated entirely to investigating elder fraud and financial abuse. He spent his golden years tracking down stolen assets for vulnerable seniors, dismantling corrupt guardianships, and ensuring that no other elderly person would ever have to fight alone in the terrifying dark. This story of Arthur Pendelton serves as a powerful, unflinching reminder that true family is not always defined by blood, but by unwavering loyalty, profound respect, and genuine love. It teaches us a vital humanistic lesson about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The elderly in our society are incredibly precious repositories of wisdom and strength, not fragile burdens to be discarded or exploited for financial gain. Arthur's story reminds us that no matter how deep the betrayal or how dark the deception might seem, the light of truth and the relentless pursuit of justice will always find a way to break through the shadows. As we bring this incredibly emotional journey to a close, I want to ask you how this story made you feel. Can you relate these events to the harsh realities of our modern world, where the vulnerable are too often overlooked or taken advantage of by those they trust the most? Please take a moment to share your thoughts and drop a comment below, because I truly want to listen to the feelings pouring from the very bottom of your heart. Your insights make this community incredibly special. If this story touched your soul, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends and family so we can continue bringing you captivating, high-quality stories every single day. I sincerely wish everyone watching this video abundant good health, a joyful life, and profound peace every single day. Goodbye for now, and I will see you in the next video.